Okay, we now get to the interesting part of this discussion, where there's going to be chance for a rebuttal. Mike is going to have a 15-minute rebuttal now, although he's going to get a minute and a half extra because Yusuf refused to acknowledge my authority as moderator and went a minute and over, 1.5 minutes over. So, Mike, you've got 16.5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike.
Well, thank you for that opening statement, Yusuf, and since you're interested in hearing, I'll say, I won't keep you waiting. Now, in my opening statement, I said that tonight I was going to defend two major contentions. Number one, there are good reasons for believing that Jesus died by crucifixion, and two, there are no good reasons for denying it. So now I'd like to review those two major contentions in light of what Yusuf just argued. Let's start with my first major contention. There are good reasons for holding that Jesus died by crucifixion. And here I provided 6 reasons. First, I said the reports of Jesus' death by crucifixion are early. Yusuf did not respond to this. Second, I said they appear in unsympathetic and even hostile sources. Yusuf did not respond to this argument. Third, I said that the reports of Jesus' death by crucifixion appear in multiple independent sources, such as the unsympathetic sources, many of those that are independent of themselves, much in the early Christian literature, and even if we look at the gospel sources, you're looking at Mark, M, L, John, so multiple, and plus there's multiple literary forms. This is the strongest kind of multiple attestation historians can hope for, period. Yusuf didn't respond to this. I said that the early reports the reports of Jesus' death by crucifixion appear in sources that are embarrassing, such as I mentioned the Jewish and Christian martyrdom literature and compare that with the passion narratives in the synoptics. Yusuf didn't respond to that either. Fifthly, I argued that there is a very low probability of surviving crucifixion. Now, Yusuf did respond to this. First of all, he said that Pilate was surprised. This is in Mark 15:44. He was surprised that Jesus had survived. Yes, but we have to look at the rest of the text too. This is called the cherry-picking fallacy, because the cherry-picking fallacy is like when you pick the cherry picker picks a few really ripe cherries off the tree and presents them as that's what the whole tree is saying. But if someone looked at the cherries on the tree and found that the rest of them weren't anywhere near being as ripe, in other words, presenting those ripe cherries gives a distorted view of what the tree is all about. And that's what we have here. Pilate, yes, he was surprised that Jesus died quickly, but same chapter, in fact, within just a couple of verses, because that's 15:44 of Mark, 15:37, Jesus breathed his last. 15:39, the centurion saw how Jesus breathed his last. 15:45, Pilate ascertained from the centurion that Jesus was dead. What about, he says, well, the centurion saw Jesus was dead. Did he? Did he see him dead? Or did he surmise he was dead? And then he says there's multiple accounts in modern times of people who were presumed dead, but they were really alive after all. Yes, that's correct. But none of the instances involve an executed person. And there's a big difference there. Roman executioners would know when the victim was dead because they weren't pushing up for air. And Yusuf is correct here. They would die of too much carbon dioxide buildup in the lungs from being in the down position, and they would have to pull up or push up on their legs to expel that excess carbon dioxide and then go back. And of course, they keep doing this. You break their legs so they can't push up anymore. They die a very painful death of convulsions, painful convulsions of too much carbon dioxide. So it was fairly easy to tell when a person was dead. He said, well, Pilate was reluctant to have Jesus crucified. Yes, but we have to look at history here, because Pilate had a protector in Rome named Sejanus. And just recently, Sejanus had been executed by Tiberius Caesar on suspicion of treason. So, of course, Pilate knows that Caesar's got his eyes on him, and Pilate's not going to do any missteps that's going to cause suspicion. So as soon as the Jewish leaders said, if you release this man Jesus, you are no friend of Caesar's, Jesus' fate was sealed. Make no mistake about it. He says, well, people in the Philippines are crucified and hung up all day and they don't die. That's correct, but they aren't scourged beforehand as the Romans scourged their victims. The Roman philosopher and lawyer Seneca, perhaps the brightest mind of the Roman mind of the first century, described crucified victims after scourging as being maimed, misshapen, deformed, nailed, and drawing the breath of life amid long, drawn-out agony. That does not sound like the way folks are in the Philippines. The folks in the Philippines aren't nailed in the same spots in the hands and the feet. They have something to stand on, which the ancient victims of crucifixion in Rome didn't have. They didn't have these little platforms that they put their feet on. That didn't come until the 3rd or 4th century. So it's not at all the same process. Okay, he also said that it was shown in antiquity that victims could last up to 3 days. That's correct, outside of Jerusalem. You see, Josephus, in his Jewish Wars, Book 4, Section 317, talks about that in the day just before the fall of Jerusalem, and this would have been a couple years before, maybe in the years 67, 68, that the Romans hired some missionaries. They came into Jerusalem, they killed some of the Jews, and it says that the Jews were outraged because they refused to give them proper burials. It was the practice of the Jews in Jerusalem to remove the crucified and the condemned prior to sunset and give them a proper burial. So, irrespective of what the Roman policy was outside of Jerusalem, they did make exceptions in Jerusalem, according to extra-biblical ancient historians. He also said that Jesus' bones weren't broken, and Jesus was alive. It said that Jesus was alive when he was pierced. Well, no, he wasn't either. John 19:33 says, "So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and the other who had been crucified with him." Verse 33, "But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water." So we see that's mistaken. He says there were no eyewitnesses in any Gospels that saw Jesus die. Yes, there were. The Gospel of John. And even many skeptical scholars like Elaine Pagels and others will say that, even James Charlesworth at Princeton, Elaine Pagels at Princeton, will say that the Gospel of John does contain eyewitness testimony. They dispute whether the author of the Gospel of John was John the Apostle or a minor disciple that would be the beloved disciple. But most scholars today agree that there is eyewitness testimony in the Gospel of John, and that the crucifixion scene comes from an eyewitness. Argument number 6. I argued that Jesus is a true prophet who prophesied his imminent death. And here I provided 3 texts for which we can show with very high degree of historical certainty that Jesus prophesied his imminent death. And I showed that there is a catch-22 involved here, because if Jesus died an imminent death as he prophesied, well, then the Quran is mistaken because it says he didn't. On the other hand, if Jesus did not die an imminent death as he prophesied, well, then the Quran is mistaken because it refers to him as a true prophet, and he would have been a false prophet if he didn't. In either sense, the Quran is mistaken. It is not the Word of God. Now, Yusuf provided 8 arguments of his own then for rejecting Jesus' death by crucifixion. Number 1, he said God exalted Jesus instead of having him die. He didn't provide any text in support. But you know what's interesting? You can find some text in the New Testament, for example, Philippians chapter 2, the kenosis hymn, in which Jesus is exalted, and it doesn't mention his resurrection. But he does mention Jesus' death there. And because Paul mentions Jesus' resurrection in numerous other ways, and we see it in the early kerygma, that is the official apostolic preaching, we know that resurrection would have been involved in that. It's maybe like talking about the World Cup now, and let's say South Africa wins, let's hope they do, and let's say they win, maybe you don't talk about this blowout that happened today. What was the score? It was amazing. It was huge. You guys kicked some butt. It was amazing. So these would certainly include death, as the Philippians 2 hymn does. Number 2, he said Jesus died, would have had to have died then, if the scriptures of the New Testament is correct, as a blasphemer and as a cursed one. Well, the Jewish charge was of blasphemy because of Jesus' statement before the high priest that he claimed to be the Messiah, the Son of God, and the apocalyptic Son of Man in Daniel 7, who would be worshipped and served as only God is served. In other words, he was saying, my Father and I have the same DNA. We're made of the same stuff, and I'm going to come back as a co-occupant on his throne. That's why he was charged with blasphemy. It doesn't mean he's a blasphemer. It only means you're a blasphemer if what you're saying is false. The Jewish leaders didn't believe it. Did he die as a curse? Yes. So he could be an atonement for our sins. Number 3, he argued about parallels in other dying and rising gods, and he mentioned 2, Mithras and Orpheus. But this is mistaken. There is no reference to a death or resurrection in Mithras anywhere. I challenge him to produce a primary source, not an internet infidel who's published on there, and your only credential to publish on the web is you got to be able to breathe. Publishing on the web does not make you a world-class scholar by publishing on the World Wide Web. I want a primary source from antiquity that predates Christ that mentions a death of Mithras. He mentioned Orpheus. Orpheus did not die, but entered the underworld to rescue his wife. But he emerged without her. That isn't a resurrection, and there was no crucifixion. Orpheus was killed later when attacked by some women and torn to pieces. His head sang as it floated down the river. So I don't see where this really has anything to do to call into question the crucifixion of Jesus. He says, well, the Gospels were unknown before Justin. That's false. Papias, around the year 110, perhaps even earlier, mentions the writing of the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and John. And then later on, it's Justin who mentions Luke. He says that Mark was not an eyewitness. No, but Papias does record that Mark recorded the memoirs of Peter. And this is multiply attested. It's a unanimous voice within the early Christian literature. Then he said, well, a crucified Messiah is a contradiction. And he said, don't touch my anointed ones and do my prophets no harm. This is God's command. But just like in the Quran, there's no promise that people are going to keep God's commands. He says, now I know that the Lord saved his anointed. Yes, his anointed was saved from God's final and never-ending punishment. Well, then he quotes Hebrews 5:7, and I understand that this is a confusing verse for a lot of Muslims, where it says that Jesus offered up prayers to God who could save him from death, and his prayers were answered. But ladies and gentlemen, I want to submit to you again that Yusuf has once again committed the cherry-picking fallacy. Because if you continue to read through Hebrews, you find, in the letter of Hebrews, you find numerous verses that talk about Jesus' death. For example, in chapter 2, verse 9. Remember, this is the same letter of Hebrews 5:7. Hebrews 2:9. Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. 2:14, just 5 verses later. Now, since the children have flesh and blood in common, Jesus also shared in these, so that through death he might destroy the one holding the power of death, that's the devil. Hebrews 13:20 and 21. Now may the God of peace, who brought up from the dead the great shepherd of the sheep through the blood of the eternal covenant, Jesus our Lord. So we see that in Hebrews 5:7, it's probably referring to God's lifting of his final and never-ending judgment. Number 6, he said, he presents some sort of conspiracy theory between Pilate's wife and the centurion. Well, Yusuf's an attorney, so I'm just going to challenge him. You can't just make some kind of a wild conspiracy theory. Where's your first century evidence? Give us some. And until we see that, we can't take this seriously at all. 7, he says you can't say Jesus died. I can't say it's a problem because I can't tell the specific hour in which Jesus died. Well, if Yusuf, is that really is a big thing for you, then tell me the precise hour that Muhammad received Surah 4. Finally, he talked a lot about the appearances and gave all these different kind of arguments and saying about the appearances and the disciples doubted when seeing him, or they didn't recognize him. Look, listen, I'd be happy to address these. The resurrection of Jesus, the historical evidence, is my area of expertise. I published a volume with IVP Academic last year that's over 700 pages. On this topic. So I would love to talk about this. If Yusuf wants to debate about the resurrection and the appearances, let's take a half-hour break after this debate, and I'm ready to go. But that is not the topic we agreed upon this evening. More than a month ago, we have an email trail that says that Yusuf agreed to tonight's topic. Did Jesus die by crucifixion in the first century? And so I am not going to go off topic tonight. I'm going to stick to our topic, the one that we agreed upon. He said, well, they're linked. Yes, Jesus' death and resurrection are linked because, he said, they're linked because Jesus' resurrection would be a vindication. Well, vindication of what? Of what Jesus claimed about himself. Well, I guess that can lead to another debate too. In fact, after we're done the resurrection debate, we can break for half an hour, and I'll be ready to go on that one as well. We can be here all night. That's why we had to focus on this one. Did Jesus die in the first century by crucifixion? And remember, the importance of this debate is, if he did, then Islam is false. If he did not, Christianity is false. I think it's become rather clear already this evening where the evidence points. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was a pretty 20 minutes or 16 minutes. I was just actually checking the time. Basically, Mike doesn't want to separate the issues. Now, for me, the main issue is Mike, as for the main contention of the debate in terms of the crucifixion and the resurrection, the two issues cannot be separated. Mike wants to basically separate them so that he can call to witness the fact that the world of scholars have no hesitation in pronouncing Jesus' death by crucifixion. But if in the world of scholarship per se, it is taken for granted that Jesus did not rise from the dead. Now Mike wants to have it both ways. First, he wants to use the scholars to pronounce that Jesus was dead, and then to assert that Jesus arose. He has to believe that, because Paul says if Christ be not risen, then our faith is vain and our preaching is vain. You have nothing to believe. So the point, Mike, is you cannot have your cake and eat it at the same time. If a doctor pronounces a man dead and turns around only be told that the man is still moving, would he still maintain his verdict? The only reason the scholars maintain their verdict that Jesus died by crucifixion is their firm conviction that the gospel narratives about Jesus' resurrection are either fictional or otherwise speak of a spiritual resurrection, or alternatively speak of an indication that Jesus had in fact survived and had appeared alive to his particular disciples. But Mike holds to a physical resurrection as a historical event. And I think that you should maintain that as a Muslim, if we believe that Jesus is a true prophet, but if we are to forsake this belief, as Mike would want us to have to do, then we will have to conclude with the scholars that Jesus did not rise from the dead as a historical event, whereas he died as a historical event. And since the death, according to Mike and his fellow apologists, we would conclude that Jesus was a false Messiah and he died as a curse. It's quite interesting that Mike says that I haven't dealt with the early accounts. But Mike, I did deal with it. If you look at the earliest strata of evidence, which he describes in 1 Corinthians, about Christ having died, I mentioned quite clearly that Paul has no knowledge, and he's delivering, first of all, what he received from James and Peter. And the list of appearances that he basically presents are not in chronological order. I dealt with that, Mike. The second issue about the fact about the passion narratives being particularly credible. Well, let's look at this. Let's turn to the authenticity of the Gospels. Look at the evolution of the Gospels. Mark ends with verse 8. Chapter 16, verse 8. Verse 9 to 20 is thrown out as a fabrication, the account of his resurrection. There is no description of Jesus' reappearance. Matthew adds a reappearance to his disciples, but the latter doubt. Luke has them make sure. John increases the number of appearances to the extent of removing Thomas from the Easter scene so that Jesus could appear the following week. Thus we see that as we move from one gospel to the next, from earlier to later, the number of incidents and the number of witnesses increase. What about the crucifixion narratives? Mike says that the passion narratives are all credible. Are they? Look at this. It is at the crucifixion scene, for example, if you look at one gospel going to the next, you'd see that the number of Jesus' followers increase. His mother, for example, together with a male disciple, is mentioned only in John. Whereas in Mark and Matthew, the woman looked from afar. In Luke, not only the woman, but all his acquaintances stand at a distance. But in John, Jesus talks to his mother and disciple, and hence they are within earshot. So in sum, the later the gospel, the more the writer tries to show evidence of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and we need to basically deconstruct that. It's important in evaluating debates, Mike, that we bear our mind and objective in debating. You see, if the purpose of debating is simply for the purposes of scoring points, then that could be a barrier to establishing the truth. If we want to now quibble and say, look, the topic is the crucifixion or crucifixion, but it's not just a crucifixion or crucifixion. What was the first century fate of Jesus? For a Christian, the belief is that Jesus died, and if he died as a curse, therefore Paul makes it intrinsic that he needs to rise from the dead. And again, as I mentioned, you can't have your cake and eat it at the same time. Mike cannot now refer to those particular scholars and then assert that the resurrection of Christ is historical. Because those scholars who he basically relies upon to say that Jesus died do not accept that Jesus would resurrect from the dead. Or that if Jesus appeared, we need to basically ask, was he dead in the first place? Mike's proof, for example, on the crucifixion, he says that Jesus died for crucifixion, and he says all historians agree with it, and it's multiply attested. I didn't have time to deal with that in my opening issue, but my specific response is that the historians who agree on the death agree that his death is complete and final. Every homicide detective and historian knows that a person must be presumed to have died only after he was alive. If we tell these very historians that Jesus was seen alive after the event of his death, then they would either disregard our claim that Jesus was seen alive, or they would conclude that Jesus was not really dead in the first place. On the other hand, Mike cited the historian Josephus, who wrote on the return that he found 3 of his friends hanging alive. Now, Jesus was by all accounts no more than a few hours. And how did he die so soon? It's interesting that Mike cited the Josephus story as an evidence of the effectiveness of crucifixion in death. For the 2 men died. But he seems to have ignored, Mike seems to have ignored the other logical implications of the story. The story supports the view that crucifixion takes days to kill its victims. And by the way, Mike, in the Philippines, they just are not crucified, the people are scourged. They scourge themselves. Some of them, you know, you've seen the Da Vinci Code. You remember the Da Vinci Code, the story about the Opus Dei, where people would flagellate themselves and they'd beat themselves. And that's what they do in the Philippines. And then they'll crucify themselves and they survive. Same thing that happened to Peter van der Berg. Mike conveniently does not discuss the spear thrust. The spear thrust recorded in John's Gospel could have killed Jesus if the wound was fatal and if it was historical. But most biblical scholars believe that this was not a historical incident. My demand from Mike is that he himself, does he believe whether this was a historical incident or not? I did not deny that this could have happened in some crucifixion, but all I want to know is, did Jesus himself receive such a spear thrust or not? In the end, what many scholars postulate is that the spear thrust in John's Gospel is taken by scholars to be an apologetic addition on the part of John for theological purposes. Why? Because if Jesus did not die,